Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We're starting by returning to some familiar ground this time, and while we're at it, I want to revisit the question of Bloodborne's genre. Way back in Translationborne 45, I outlined some characteristics of cosmic horror to keep in mind as the game went forward, and now, as we did with the gothic horror elements, I want to look back and see how well Bloodborne meets those criteria. Before we go through the list, though, it's worth pointing out that the characteristics I included back in episode 45 came from Wikipedia, and the current Wikipedia article has been updated such that it no longer features some of these items. However, I still think this will be an instructive exercise, since the most salient points remain unchanged, and even the ones that are outdated do describe features of H.P. Lovecraft's work. The first point involves misanthropy and anti-anthropomorphism. This is one of the criteria no longer on Wikipedia, but I think it's nevertheless relevant to Bloodborne because of the idea of transformation beyond the human. Great Ones are explicitly identified as being inhuman, for instance, and several different characters are seeking to reach their level. For people like Master Willem, Iosefka's Impostor, and presumably the heads of the various Healing Church factions, being human isn't good enough. The second item on the list is a preoccupation with viscerate textures, especially slime, and by now the relevance of this trope should be plain enough. Slugs and other sliming things have a strong association with the Great Ones, with a good example being something we learn from the Empty Phantasm shell. It's the shells with slime that harbor arcane power. The third point is another that's been removed from the relevant Wikipedia article, consisting of an antiquarian writing style. Here, I would bring up how I've remarked on several NPCs using formal and archaic speech styles, not to mention the general setting of Bloodborne being one of an earlier era. The fourth identifier, also missing from Wikipedia, is that of detachment, often with academic or scholarly intent compensating for social shortcomings. Obviously, there's a lot of scholarly study that runs through this game, but I also think the idea of detachment can be found in the level of emotional control required of a hunter. Recall how we can smash the red jewel brooch for a blood gem, emphasizing the practical over the sentimental, as well as the association we can see on items like the beast blood pellet between beasthood and euphoric feeling. There's a kind of equilibrium that seems to be the ideal state for a hunter, and a level of detachment seems like it would be helpful with that. The fifth item on the list, also removed from Wikipedia, involves questionable parentage and relations, and while this doesn't literally apply to Bloodborne, if we widen our considerations of this trope, I think it could fit well. One purpose the lack of a family serves is to emphasize how alone the protagonist is, and Bloodborne certainly isolates the player character by making them an outsider. Furthermore, another reason a questionable lineage can matter is to bring up the importance of inheritance, and here again, Bloodborne fits in nicely, with the influence of the past on the present being a continual theme. The sixth and most important point is a sense of hopelessness derived from humanity's insignificant place in the universe. Now, I've heard people make the argument that Bloodborne doesn't really fit this theme because there's hope for human ascension, and I think that position has its merits. But what I'd say in response is that the question of human significance is still important. The game does make clear that humans are generally of little cosmic significance, easily driven mad by exposure to the red moon, and commonly unable even to grasp the true state of the world. Also, by ascending to become a Great One, it seems like one must leave one's humanity behind. That just leaves the final two characteristics of things happening beyond the perspective character's understanding and the fragility of sanity, and as I've mentioned before, these are points that are easily applied to Bloodborne. The plot is frequently obtuse, and the frenzy mechanic is explicitly about sanity's vulnerability. So yes, I think Bloodborne meets most criteria for cosmic horror, even if our human capabilities were above this guy's expectations.
Oh, this cannot be. You cannot be. No, you didn't. Lord Amygdala? Oh, how did this come to pass?
If I were you, I'd be more concerned about your lies.
Now, wait just a moment. Do you think ill of me? Me?
Yes, I do. And surely that can't be that much of a surprise.
Oh, it pains me to hear it. You've made yourself a misreckoning. I shared with you a thing most secret. Now you're witness to a miracle, and all the stronger for it. It's plain as a pikestaff. Now, say in my heart, you were as a lamb to my God. Well, you weren't to know, and it wasn't for you to know. All's well that ends well, I say.
I am not amused.
No matter. Such details are trifling. We're fast friends by now. Let this express what words cannot.
Are you buying my friendship?
Oh, doubt me not, sweet compeer. What is friendship but a chance encounter?
Okay, anything else?
Well met. My apologies, but I feel a profound thought occurring on the good grace of a certain god and the way he meted out his love.
Right, I guess I'll let you live for now. In the meantime, let's talk about the translation for those lines. There are actually quite a few things that make Patch's dialogue here difficult to deal with, not least of which is the inclusion of an optional line in this character's initial reaction to being snuck up on. According to the Bloodborne lore translation guide, the reference to Amygdala is only delivered if the player has defeated that boss. This gets at an issue that comes up a lot in video game translation, and probably video game writing in general, which is that the lines that come before and after an optional bit of dialogue need to make sense whether the intervening line is spoken or not. So in this case, the question is whether the delivery of both sets of lines makes sense, whether it's, "Oh, this cannot be, you cannot be, how did this come to pass?" Or, "Oh, this cannot be, you cannot be, no you didn't. Lord Amygdala, how did this come to pass?" Now, as you just heard, I think this works out well for the official translation, but if you ignore this feature of the game and translate each line somewhat literally, as I did in my translation earlier, you can run into problems. Take out the middle line of my version, for instance, and you end up with, you, how did you get here? No, that can't be. This makes it sound like the character is denying the method we used to get into the room, which is a little weird. Meanwhile, in both the official English and the Japanese, if we get the version of this dialogue where the player character hasn't killed Amygdala, it simply sounds like Patches is incredulous about how we gained entry. Furthermore, just as crucially, with the extra line about Amygdala in place, both the official English and the Japanese versions have Patches instead sounding like he's having a hard time believing we defeated the boss. It's a deft handling of what can be a difficult issue. But there's still another challenge to a more literal approach of translating this optional line, because it doesn't actually contain a verb. The first word here is masaka, which is an expression of incredulity. It's followed by a word for you, then the particle ga to show that this word is the subject of the sentence. Next comes the Japanese name for Amygdala, and finally the particle wo to show that the boss is the direct object. In other words, it works out to something like, "Don't tell me you omitted verbed Amygdala." The idea is that Patches has realized the player character killed Amygdala, but can't bring himself to verbalize this. Since verbs come in the middle of English sentences, though, it sounds weird to leave one out. My own solution was to open with a question about Amygdala that would then allow me to trail off suggestively. The official version instead begins with an incredulous denial, then follows up with a suggestive, "Lord Amygdala?" which I think also gets across the point, although I'm a little surprised that Patches says Lord Amygdala in English, since there's no honorific being used in the Japanese. Actually, this brings me to something else I think is notable about the way the official translation handles Patches' explanation of his actions, which is the way it emphasizes mystical access to knowledge. Now, there are elements of this in the Japanese as well, but just for the sake of contrast, I want to break down Patches' arguments in detail here. This all starts when our player character indicates they have a low opinion of Patches, with the idea being that he lured us into an encounter with Amygdala under false pretenses, thinking it would be the end of us. Patches begins by pointing out that, as it happens, he hasn't lied about anything. He told us that an encounter with Holy Mystery would grant us strength as a hunter, and that's precisely how things played out. Having established this, he goes on to entertain the idea that he intended us to be a sacrifice, which he assures us is purely for the sake of argument. Well, he claims that as an intention, this could only be the product of his own mind, which we can have no way of knowing. And since intentions are unknowable, they count for nothing. What I like about this particular bit of sophistry is that he's making a scholarly appeal about what counts as evidence in an effort to dismiss the importance of his intent. You can see this earlier in the conversation as well, with one of the meanings of the word sujichigai being unreasonable or illogical. This sets up the idea that Patches is going to try and reason his way out of this confrontation, and in a game that in many ways follows mistakes that scholars make, I find this bit of rationalization quite apt. However, this comes across more clearly to me in the Japanese than it does in the English, mostly I think because of the final line. If this had instead ended with something like, "Well, none can know another's heart, can they? No, such matters are of no account, I say," then I imagine the logical side of things would have been clearer. Still, emphasizing the unknowable does fit with the themes of Bloodborne, and Patches is indicating that his motive was to offer us up as a living sacrifice, so I think the official approach works here, even if the scholarly argument angle isn't as clear. But speaking of scholars and mystical knowledge, I think it's time we examined a unique version of a familiar item. Third Umbilical Cord, a great relic also known by the name String of Eyes. Even among higher rank ones, only infants possess these. The term umbilical cord derives from this. Once, schoolhead Willem sought this for the sake of an eye of thought, to embrace eyes within his brain, in order to gain the thoughts of the great higher rank ones, or possibly to rank among the higher rank ones as a human. So here we have another third umbilical cord, and since the last time we looked at one of these was way back in episode 17, I want to begin by noting how in both English and Japanese, the opening set of lines are exactly the same, while everything following the paragraph break is different. Actually, this particular third chord is somewhat unique in this, as the other versions of this item that we can find have more shared text. But for now, I just want to point out that where the first third chord we read referred to an encounter with the pale moon, this one is about Master Willem's quest to elevate his thoughts. Rather than focus on the end of this description, though, I want to talk more about the translation of the text that all of these items share. Let's start with the different English names for these items. As I discussed in my special on the game's regional differences, the North American version of the game calls these 1/3 of umbilical cords, while in the British English release they're called Third Umbilical Cords. I wasn't aware of this back in episode 17 when I first discussed the item name, but apparently both are considered official. This is why when I put the official translations on screen earlier, I used parentheses to cover both versions. Still, it's worth noting that the UK English third umbilical cord is closer to the Japanese, and taken together with the first few lines of the description, this may actually be important to Bloodborne's lore. That's because these items are not literally umbilical cords. In fact, depending on how you interpret the Japanese, they may not even be precursors to the umbilical cord, as the official translation has it. So let's take a look at what these interpretations are and where they come from. The third line of the Japanese is the relevant one here, and it begins with the Japanese term for umbilical cord in quotation marks. Then the rest of the sentence indicates that this initial term originates from that. And this is where the ambiguity comes in, because what exactly is that referring to? As far as I can tell, both my original rough translation from episode 17 and the official translation interpret it as a reference to the item name. In other words, the idea would be that umbilical cords originate from third umbilical cords. This is why the phrase precursor to the umbilical cord seems to have been used. However, the other possibility is that the word that in this line is referring instead to the fact stated in the previous line, which is that even among great ones, only infants possess these, which is clearly a reference to the item name. In other words, the reason the term umbilical cord is associated with these cords of the eye is because only infants have them. This is why my literal translation earlier in this episode was, the term umbilical cord derives from this. To be fair, there is reason to think the term sore, or that, would be used to refer to the item name. Among other things, there's the fact that there are other item descriptions where it's undeniably used that way. In this instance, though, given that these sentences are grouped with the opening line about the alternate name cord of the eye, I find myself currently leaning more in favor of the other interpretation. I think this whole opening section is all about explaining this item's two names. With that in mind, then, let's return to the issue of how these names may impact Bloodborne's lore, beginning by looking at the alternate one. The official English has this as cord of the eye, and I have it as string of eyes. Both of these work as interpretations of the Japanese, though my own rough translation has been influenced by the visual used for the item, which looks to me like a curled up string or cord with eyes all over it. If you're so inclined, though, another interpretation of the original Japanese hitomi no himo would be simply eye cord. What's more, if you combine this with the idea that the umbilical cord part of the item name derives from where this item is found, you might choose to substitute that part of the item name for the alternative in the description. This creates the phrase sanbonme no hitomi no himo in Japanese, or third eye cord in a mix of the official UK English and an alternative translation. Of course, 1/3 of cord of the eye doesn't work at all here, which is where we see the importance of the UK English translation being closer to the Japanese come into play. Having said all of that, though, I also feel I should point out that this interpretation does have its issues. For one thing, even if it's only the term for umbilical cord that's identified later in the Japanese description, that doesn't necessarily explain why one part of the name for this item should be combined with its entire alternative name. More importantly, though, I think it's a theory that works better in English than it does in Japanese, since, as I discussed in the previous episode, the counter hon applies to long, thin things, not round ones like eyes. This means that sanbonme no hitomi no himo maintains more of an emphasis on the third cord rather than the third eye. And having noted that, I think we're finally done discussing the issues of these item names, which seems like a good place to end the episode. So let me know if you have any feedback for me, and until next time, thanks for watching, everyone.